Hi, it's Carol Salter here reading from her book Witch on the Warpath. Last chapter we left it where Onk exploded through the shed to rescue his friend Hearty. Now we're on to chapter 17, Penge East. Hearty knew what an enraged city troll could do after seeing how Onk finished off the weasels earlier in their travels. Onk turned and glanced down at Hearty, relieved to see him alive. A deep frown lined Hearty's forehead in trepidation of Onk's next action. "Scare," he said, winking at Hearty, a secret smile playing on his lips. And scare he did. The orc and fairy tried to flee in terror for their lives, or so they thought. Missing the chance to grab the skinny red demon as he fled into his dimension, Onk stared at the two miserable felons. Both were pressed against the far wall, trying unsuccessfully to pretend they were stains on the woodwork. The large, craggy M25 tarmac orc began to cry. His companion glanced at him, a look of utter distaste on his face at his partner's weakness. He believed he was at least making some effort on his part to look fierce in the face of insurmountable odds. Then Onk roared. The fragile panes of glass along one side of the shed vibrated with the frequency and shattered outwards under the vast amount of decibels. This provided the luckless pair with a fortunate means of escape. They inched their way along the wall, facing Onk's roars and the tadpole frying fetid breath, which was enough to frighten brave heroes, let alone nasty criminal types like these. They saw their one chance of freedom nearing. Onk roared again and again, standing protection over Hearty's wrapped body at his feet while the roof shook. Long, dripping strands of drool rained down on Hearty from above. Onk seemed, from Hearty's angle, like a dentally challenged St. Bernard dog. Hearty's vocal cords remained paralysed, so he simply had to lie there and endure the sound barrier breaking noise and the deluge of wet slobbery saliva soaking him. On a positive note, the drool seemed to contain some sort of solvent for the strands of web encasing him, and they were weakening. This was good, because Tiny and Robin were having a devil of time struggling without success to extract him. First the wingless fairy, which also seemed to be wet around the trouser region, then the trembling orc, climbed over the tins of paint, flower pots and assorted boxes blocking their path. Neither helped the other, each being intent on their own survival. The fairy reached the sill first, vaulted over it and outside to safety. The orc, being larger and slower, made hard work of it, as he struggled to keep up with his fleeing companion after his leg got trapped in a roll of chicken wire. Tiny was getting worried. He didn't know Onk that well, and based on his knowledge of trolls, he thought Onk might eat the poor unfortunate orc in a minute. When Onk threw him a crafty and reassuring wink as the last fugitive escaped through the glassless window frame, Tiny went back to the task of freeing his bound friend. The events of the last few hours had taken their toll on Hearty. Fairies are never strong physically. Once freed from his bonds, Tiny observed Hearty was trembling from his feet to his wingtips. He was in no state to continue their journey in his present condition. Tiny and Robin insisted both return to Putney so Hearty could recuperate. Hearty didn't argue. He allowed Onk to carry him on the palm of one of his great big smelly hands. After a bath in drool, Hearty didn't feel there was any point complaining about soiled palms. Unknown to any of them, Lenny observed the whole horrendous situation without saying a word or offering any invisible assistance. Lost to the physical world for decades, Lenny's emotions had shriveled. His ability for empathy atrophied. He'd followed Onk rather than Harty when they arrived the day before, so like Onk, he didn't have a clue to Harty's whereabouts. He stayed at Crystal Palace Park when Onk left, unable to keep up with the troll's incredible sprinting pace. He was considering investigating the park's squirrel population when Onk returned, his friends in tow, and things got a whole lot more interesting. He'd argue that a researcher doesn't become involved with his subjects, but it's unlikely Onk would have seen it that way if he knew. Lenny plodded behind them as they all returned to Putney Vale, trying to convince himself that if they didn't know about him, then he couldn't be blamed for not helping. Harty dozed as they traversed the miles, falling asleep long before they reached Tiny's holly tree. Onk lowered his friend into Tiny's home, where Robin covered him with a throw of gathered sheep's wool. Onk lay down under the somewhat misshapen tree again, creating the impression of a ferocious guard dog, his snores echoing round the cemetery, telling everyone the city troll was back. The rest gave Onk time to reflect. He recognised he was changing, becoming something more than he was, and different. He didn't have words for it, but it didn't frighten him. He was a city troll, and nothing ever spooked him. However, almost losing the fairy babe, meeting Fim, and now nearly losing Harty to the Neath realms, made him realise there was more to life, and more to lose. Harty and Onk waved goodbye to their friends for the second time after 2 days' rest, recommencing their journey. They bypassed Crystal Palace Park, going round the outside railings instead of through the centre, in silence. Harty was subdued, remembering the horror he'd endured. He shuddered at the recollection of the Neath demon and how close he'd come to being trapped inside the dark realms forever. Onk, his newfound emotions swirling in his head, understood his friend's need to avoid the park because of his recent ordeal. It wasn't quite clear how he felt about it, though. He remembered feeling something like this when the old hermit died, but this time it was stronger, as if his heart had been pulled inside out. A worrying sensation, considering Harty hadn't died. Putting on a brave face, Harty smiled up at Onk from his riding position on Onk's shoulder as the troll smiled down, and the pair continued towards their next destination, Penge East. They reached the diesel-stained brown stones identifying Penge East railway track by mid-afternoon. Onk stepped over the first set of rails and trudged up the inside of the line, stepping on the concrete spaces towards the siding Harty indicated. It was empty. No trains were in sight, so Onk sat down on the wooden buffer, swinging his legs like a bored child as he relaxed. "Wait?" asked Onk, looking down at Harty, who alighted from the troll's shoulder onto the buffer next to him. "Yes," replied Harty, looking up at the huge tower of Onk. Together they rested on the buffer, enjoying the peace and the local rabbits venturing back out onto the track. The rabbits, watching and whiffling, headed for the concrete spaces, nibbling on blades of grass brave enough to grow between the gaps. A blackbird burst into song from the top of a solitary blackbird bush, the sound breaking Harty's revelry. Glancing over, he noticed the ripened blackberries for the first time. Realising how hungry he was, he flew off over to the bush and began helping himself. Pulling off a huge juicy berry, he returned to the top of the buffer. He removed one single fat globe and sat sucking the sphere. The sweet purple fluid ran back down both his arms, staining them bruised purple to the elbow. "Onk, look!" Hearty called, holding up his prize. "Blackberries!" Onk gazed at Hearty's tiny morsel and shrugged. No one picked and ate wild blackberries anymore, thought Hearty. He remembered hordes of small children armed with plastic containers attacking blackberry bushes. They'd stuff their tiny stained mouths and their Tupperware boxes so mummies could make jams, crumbles and pies using strange ceramic funnels. These days, blackberries sat forgotten, a childhood memory stretching back to days of innocence and less convenient food. Onk had never tried blackberries. They were food for birds or squirrels. Those were the only creatures he'd ever seen eating them. Trolls didn't eat fruit, though Onk had eaten a mouldy green apple pie once, and that was delicious. Hearty seemed to be enjoying himself, judging by the moans of appreciation and slurping sounds. Trolls didn't try new things, he realised. With that thought jostling about in his overlarge head, Onk got up, ambled over to the blackberry bush and decimated it in seconds. They were good as a snack, he decided afterwards, if a little spiky in places. The brambles hadn't deterred Onk. He'd eaten them as well. The blackbird, which was going to eat the berries after he'd finished singing his song of salutation to them, was extremely annoyed. Ruffling up his feathers, he tipped his tail up and down several times in disgust at the troll's poor manners, bending his bird's equivalent of knees in Onk's direction to emphasise how displeased he was. He left in a whistled huff, with nothing left to sing about and nothing left to eat, going in search of food with fewer competitors. Onk and Hearty sat in the early evening light, both covered in purple stains, waiting on the buffer at the end of the line at Penge East Station. Just over an hour later, a vibration arrived on the wind. It fluctuated on the breeze, coming and going like a spring tide. It was the sort of noise you're not quite sure you've heard, so you tilt your head this way and that, like when you hear an emergency siren fading in and out. Beneath the wavering noise was another sound, inaudible to human ears. It sighed and breathed, it rumbled and groaned, and it was alive. In the distance, a tiny white light appeared. For a long while it seemed to stay the same size. Then, in one blink, it jumped, becoming larger and more intimidating. A single bright eye grew as it neared. An outline evolved around it, a vertical oblong, dark in colour, with its single flaming orb staring above it. A window, like a giant's eyelid. The 5:47 p.m. to Penge East pulled into the station further down the track. People disembarked from the train, disappearing as they flowed into the station house and reappearing, as if by magic, out on the street beyond. Some were collected by loved ones, hugged and sped off home for meals. Others tramped off into the distance to locate cars left in long-stay car parks for exorbitant prices. Another cohort continued on foot, tramping up Station Road towards the High Street in order to catch other forms of transport. Those remaining began the weary walk home. 3 or 4 people stayed on the platform in order to make connections, use the loo, or fight the recalcitrant vending machine because their blood sugar was lower than their desire to leave. At last, the sentient train was almost alone, its passengers already a distant memory. The 40-something driver shunted it into the siding where Hearty and Onk sat. Once happy with the train's position, the driver turned the key to off and the engine died. Locking the heavy grey door to the driver's cab, he stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel as he wended his way home in the dimming light. The train, a long dark tunnel of metal in the deepening night, gave a huge relieved sigh. "I'm getting too old for this," he mumbled. "One day soon I'll be assigned to the marshalling yard, and from there to the depot, where I'll be cannibalised and regenerated into cars, cans or gardening tools. Until then I'll plod my journey across the city from north to south 16 times a day, from sunrise to sunset." The train was settling down to a deeper rest when it realised someone or something was sat on its buffer, swinging their legs. "Who's there?" he groaned in a low, irritated monotone. "Mac, it's me, Hearty," said Hearty, fluttering over to Mac. Hearty. The only Hearty I ever knew was Hearty Springfield, that mischievous little sprite from across the stream," rumbled the old train. "The very same," whispered Hearty, landing on Mac's running plate. Hearty Springfield. I remember the day I met Hearty Springfield. The train went off at a tangent here, or should that be a branch line, into an anecdotal story about their meeting. It took a very long time to tell, for although trains move fast and are very intelligent, their speech patterns are not. Onk was looking bored about halfway through. There's no stopping a train once it's started, unless there's a cow on the track. Like a train reaching its destination, the train called Mac slowed down, stopped speaking, and waited. Hearty wasn't precisely sure where to begin. It had been a while since he'd seen Mac, about 14 human years to be exact, and the train wasn't looking so good anymore. His paintwork was faded and peeling in places. There was a fair share of graffiti in bright fluorescent shades adorning his bodywork. His windows were dirty, covered with grime and grease, and his wheels were rusted and orange. Today, Mac looked more in need of help than Onk did. When Hearty first met Mac, he'd been new and shiny. His paintwork gleamed and his windows shone. Seeming to guess the reason for Hearty's hesitation, Mac spoke. "I'm still the same, Mac. However old I might look, Hearty." Hearty felt embarrassed. Of course, this was Mac, his old friend, despite how he appeared on the surface. "Mac, we need your help," said the elf, the feeling of embarrassment decreasing. "Really?" inquired Mac. "It's been a while since anybody asked for my help. I've been running back up on the underground for the last 5 years, so I don't come up here for fresh air anymore. This used to be my permanent siding, you know, until the National Rail Network went private," he reminisced. "Those humans are going to have a lot to answer for when the dimensions reunite, you mark my words. You were lucky to catch me. I was only moved here today to cover a breakdown. It must be fate. So, How can I help my little flying friend? Hearty introduced Onk to Mac and explained he and the troll were going to stay with a cousin of Hearty's in Canterbury. They needed to travel there without anyone knowing, especially evildoers. Hearty told Mac he had a bad feeling they were being followed by someone who intended harm to Onk. Hearty didn't mention the fairy babe, deciding the less people who knew about her the better. In truth, Mac couldn't be described as people, or even one person, but he was more than a machine and greater than the sum of his mechanical parts. Experts in philosophical mathematics will know what that means, but then they would probably want to try and disprove it. After listening to Hearty's request, Mac sat for a while thinking about the issue. He knew Hearty wasn't telling him everything, but he felt he would if he had pressed him. Even without knowing all the details, Mac decided to aid his friend. Onk, meanwhile, had wandered off along the track, following his exceptional nose. It was scenting rail kill, which he found further up the line under a second blackberry bush. It was in the shape of a weak, dead ginger tom, and was quite high, but that, together with the large number of fly larvae wriggling on its sides, gave Onk's meal an extra succulent juiciness. Hearty heard the cracking, crunching sound, which told him he really didn't want to know what Onk was eating. Later, he noticed a new bauble hanging from Onk's neck in the form of a green gem set cat collar, with the name Lucky inscribed on a tiny heart-shaped medallion at its end. Hearty refused to dwell on the collar, in case it fueled a gruesome picture in his mind. Instead, he flew off to find his own type of food. Finding a single mulberry tree quivering within a gnarly group of sycamores, Hearty landed on its upper branches and shared some of his energy. The tree vibrated in gratitude, and Hearty dined that night on a delicious tender shoot in return for the favour. He wanted him to stay, but Hearty returned to sleep on the buffer. Mac had a clever mind, and he would come up with a good plan. Hearty wanted to be close, just in case the train forgot his plan in the excitement of meeting up with Hearty again, or the driver returned and took Mac back into service. Whilst Hearty was worried about them being pursued, he placed his faith in Mac solving their transportation problem. As Hearty alighted on the buffer, he noticed Onk already sound asleep and snoring against Mac's side. He wasn't sure if Onk had eaten enough today, and resolved to find him better food tomorrow. Anything to stop Onk accumulating more gruesome pet trophies about his person. I hope you enjoyed that chapter, and look forward to seeing you next time for chapter 18, The Meeting. Goodbye.